within the next day or so, and you'll be able to download and you'll be able to view it either on our website or on our YouTube channel, which is Upper Dublin Parks and Recreation on YouTube. I do have a couple of housekeeping items to go through before we get tonight started. All participants, with the exception of the speaker and Upper Dublin Township staff, will be muted with a video camera or web camera turned off during the presentation. There will be one question and answer session at the end of the presentation. We ask only during the question and answer session that you would put your questions, we would open it up for your questions. You can put any questions that you would like throughout the presentation in the chat box, and we will address them one by one. At the end of the presentation, you'll be able to raise your hand if you would like to interact with the speaker directly. You would press the raise your hand button in the reactions button on your toolbar at the bottom of your screen. One by one, we will call on each participant with their virtual hand raised. We will unmute you and turn your video camera on if you would prefer that. Upper Dublin Township staff at any time reserves the right to mute a participant, end the video stream of a participant, or terminate or end the meeting at our discretion due to hackers, inappropriate language, or any other activity that the staff deems inappropriate. We ask for your patience and understanding as we navigate through these unprecedented times and work through our virtual public offerings. We welcome any comments and suggestions for virtual meeting protocols for future meetings. I would like to now turn the program over to Cindy Nuss. Cindy?
Hi, welcome. I bet by now you've been gardening like crazy because you're stuck at home. I know that the nurseries are all sold out of plants, and my neighbor comes over every other day to ask me questions. So, and a lot of it is this bad? So here we go. I'll let you know what's bad and what's good, or what's not bad. So first of all, these invasive plants are exotic plants that came from another country, and the ones I'm going to talk about today are the ones that are invasive in our region, which is called the Piedmont region. A lot of plants that are invasive have been brought here and planted over and over and over again. It's not like they came and they proliferated like mad and took over the world. It's our fault. We planted them everywhere. We thought they were beautiful or that they had some kind of great function. And whenever I can, I'll tell you how they got here. I don't know about most of them, but I know a few. And then you'll understand. But whether or not we have a problem with a plant being invasive depends on where we are, because Philadelphia is one of the worst places because we are the original importers of plants. John Bartram brought a lot of plants here, and the New York Botanic Garden also. So Philadelphia and the East Coast are way worse than some parts of the country. Now, you can go to the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources and look up their invasive plant list. I made this presentation up a while back, and things may have changed, but they rate things based on the whole entire state. And like I said, we are in the Piedmont region, which may be different than, say, out near the Pittsburgh regions. So what they do is they rank it according to the severity of the problem. Number one ranking is the worst, with the exotic plant species that basically takes over every space it can, and the native plant communities are extremely displaced by this. You see a lot of this in the unmanaged lands like parks or wild game lands, things like that. A significant threat is when the exotic plant species possesses characteristics of invasive species, but they are not presently considered to spread as aggressively. And easily into the native plant communities as the rank 1. And rank 3 is the lesser threat, which means that people have found them in disturbed areas, but they haven't been known to grow very well or extremely prolifically in undisturbed areas. And then there's also the watch list, which exotic plant species are that are problems in different surrounding states or different communities around us, and they need to be monitored. And you'll see on these lists some of the things that you might have seen in your own yard. So here's the list of trees. I'm going to break it down. Today I'm going to talk about the trees and the shrubs. And then I have part 2, which is vines, perennials, and grasses. It's just a lot to absorb in one sitting, so I thought I'd break it up. You can see the worst 2 on the list are Tree of Heaven, which is the host plant for the spotted lanternfly in its own country. So I don't know whether, I think it might have come from China, and there the spotted lanternfly lives primarily on this plant, but here it will suck the life out of anything it gets its hands on. Now, the Aralia elata, the Japanese Angelica tree, it's a pretty common sight in driving down, say, Lincoln Drive or down to on the Schuylkill through Philadelphia. You can see it on the cliffs on the sides of the road. Once it gets to a place like that, it's really hard to get rid of. It's hard to get rid of anyway, but in a place like that, it's almost impossible. And then there's the Norway maple, mimosas, alders. I'm going to go through these. You can see Callery pear, which is also known as Bradford pear. And then I just want you to point out that Japanese maple is on the watch list. And I've been seeing a lot of them lately in places where they, were not planted. So keep an eye out on them. So here are some of our wonderful exotic trees. First is the Tree of Heaven. I never even saw this plant until the spotted lanternfly story unfolded, and then I was taught about it. It looks very much like, you can see sumac or English or a walnut tree, black walnut tree. But the thing that distinguishes it is it has smooth edges. They call it entire, smooth. And all the other ones have sort of toothed edges. And also it has these little teeth on the bottom. You can see right at the bottom. That's really easy to identify the tree with that if you can get one of the leaves off of it. Another thing, I saw it driving by on Susquehanna Road near Limekiln Pike, where they cross over right past the Drescher Triangle. There was one on the right-hand side, and the reason I knew it was that was because of the seed heads. Now, there's a male and a female of this plant, so the females only make the seeds, so the males won't have that. But when you do see that, you know that that's a female, and that's the problem with the spotted lanternfly, because those female plants reproduce like mad. They have very high germination rates, and they produce huge amounts of seeds that are windborne, and you find them anywhere and everywhere. I find them in every garden I work in, and I pull them out right away. Hopefully when they're small, because they get to be difficult to get out once they get larger. And we brought them here because they would grow anywhere, and we wanted things to grow, say, along, you know, the highway where we didn't want erosion. We had bad areas, so I think it was our government that actually brought these over. And another indication that you have this tree is if you get a leaf and you crush it and you smell it, it smells kind of like burnt peanut butter. It really has a strong odor to it. So that's a pretty good one for identifying it. This is the Angelica tree. I think of it more as a shrub. I've never really seen it very tall. It seems to get about maybe 30 feet tall at the maximum, a small tree. But you see it in flower a lot at the end of the summer. And if you come across it in the woods or somewhere near where you live, it will have this nasty thorns on the stem. Now, we have an American version of this called the native devil's walking stick, but it's really not very prevalent in this part of the state. And the way that you can tell is that on this one, on the invasive one, the petiole, or the little stem that holds the leaf onto the stem, is really short. So that the other one, the native walking stick, has a longer petiole. But I'm going to tell you, you're never really going to see a native walking stick. So just assume it's this. Now, the thing it does is it's a colonizer. So it grows out from the trunk, and it keeps getting wider and wider and wider. And it has roots that run underneath the ground and then pops up in different spots. And if you don't get every last root from this thing, it will come back. So you have to be really meticulous when you get it out. And it's not easy. The next one you may be familiar with is the Norway maple. It's very dense. It has a very shady canopy. The leaves are fairly large compared to like a sugar maple, and they have more pointy tips. And if you break a leaf off, it will ooze some white sap. And if you see the seeds, these are called samras. In a native maple, they're sort of more like at a 90-degree angle, and these are more straight out. So you can tell by looking at the samras if they're on the tree. And then you can also look at the stems, if you don't have leaves, and they look a little different from the Acer, the sugar maple, in that they're fatter, you know, fatter buds and they're green, whereas these are dark buds and they're skinnier, more shingle shaped. And the bark is very, you know, rough with a lot of ridges in it. These are really invasive here. They're labeled number 2 for the state, but for here, they're probably a 1. You see them everywhere. Now, this is a tree that I never really saw until I started going to school at the Barnes, and they had them there as specimen trees. And they have a really interesting bark. It looks like cork, and that's mainly how you identify it, but it has these berries, dark berries in clusters, and long green shiny leaves, and it has a very characteristic buds. They call this a scar. That's where the leaf comes off and a new leaf forms. It has like a collar around the bud. So if you don't have any leaves on the tree and you're looking at it going, what is this thing? You might want to look up this cork tree and see if that's what it looks like. Almost looks like a Mexican hat. But I honestly have to say, I have not seen these working in, you know, restoring parks or gardening in people's yards, but it is around. Now, I remember this one from when I was a kid, because it was always fun because you could touch it and it would curl up. The leaves are sensitive to touch. And it's in the pea family, so it has these, you know, like bean-shaped pods, and it has these unusual pink flowers. And right now I'm working in a garden, and the next door neighbor has this hanging over the fence into the people's yard. And my neighbor had it, and he wanted it, and he couldn't get it to grow, but it kept coming up in my yard. So, but they do sell a cultivar of this that's purple. I really doubt that it's any less invasive. It's just purple and more appealing. But the foliage is pretty distinctive. It almost looks like shingles. Now, I never saw this until I started working at Robbins Park. And this is the European black alder. And the buds on it look like duckbill when it's, you know, the leaves are not out, but when the leaves are fully out, you can see that they have this very unusual shape, plus they have this notch that is very characteristic. There's nothing else that I've ever seen with that. But they have to be fully out. They can't be just coming out. So you have to wait a little while. Plus they have these interesting seeds. And once it gets grown up more, once it ages somewhat, it has this sort of chunky bark with, like, they call it plates. And it has like a grayer underneath area in here. You can't really see it, but I wouldn't be able to identify it on bark alone. You need a couple characteristics, I would say, the leaf bud and the leaves are probably your best bet. Now, I'm sure you've seen this princess tree. When it blooms, it's stunning, and it sticks out because of its color. And it has huge leaves that are velvety. And the bark is also distinctive with the orange fissures in it. And when the seeds are dried out, they look like jingle bells in a way, all connected together. And there is another tree that looks similar to this, but it doesn't have the same flower structure. So it's a catalpa, the other tree, and it has a very different flower. And it, but if you're just looking at leaves, you might have a hard time trying to figure it out. It's prolific. It's a prolific cedar. You know, see 20 million seeds per plant each year, and they're blown by the wind. So I've seen it along 309, and it's very hard to manage when it's up on a hill near a highway. So keep your eye out for those big leaves. This is a Callery pear, or the Bradford pear. The Bradford pear is a cultivar, or a special selection of the Callery pear. The parent Callery pear has nasty thorns, whereas the Bradford pear does not. And they thought that the Bradford pear was sterile, but they found out that it wasn't once they started getting other cultivars of Callery pear, not Bradford pear, but say some other pear. They interbred, and they caused a huge proliferation of these Callery pears. And you see these all along the highway. They're one of the first trees to bloom in April. And if you just look along the edges of the roads, you'll know it's them. They have sort of a gumdrop shape to them, I'll say. But they're really, the shape is pretty characteristic, although, young ones might not be so well developed. And they have these little, they're pears, but they're very, very small. So the birds eat them, and they distribute them all over the place. I remember seeing a whole huge forest of them at Welsh Road and Dreshertown Road, and they had to chop them all down to build the new complex they have there. And I couldn't decide which was worse, having all the development or having the pears. I don't know how to answer the raised hand. Sandra, can you hold till the end and I will answer your question? I'm not really sure. Well,
I'll get it when we're to that point.
Well, you'll do it at the end? Okay. Okay. The White Mulberry was brought here to breed silkworms, which it wasn't working. It didn't work, but that's why it was brought here. And it looks like our native red mulberry, but it has a few distinguishing characteristics. They exude the milky sap like the Norway maple, and they have male and female flowers on different plants. Now, here's a picture of the bark. It almost looks it's really pretty distinctive. I almost always know it's that when I see it. It has the little, they're not exactly lenticels, but they're little, like, I'll call them bumps. And then the older bark has the orange fissures in it. And the leaves vary. You can see all these different leaves. When they're young, I always see this one. And I pulled about 6 of them out today alone. And they often have orange roots when you pull them out. So that's a characteristic of them. But the birds eat the berries and they spread them all over the place, and it's very hard to control them. They are everywhere. Now, I got this little chart I found distinguishing the two, but what I'm going to say is that our red mulberry is very rare here. I've never seen it. I know that it exists, but I've never seen it. And the fruit color is different. No, the fruit is darker, and the twigs are tan versus pinkish brown, which, you know, there's always a fine line. It's hard to tell them apart. We look at them when we're trying to figure out whether to rip them down, and 9 times out of 10, well, I'd say more like 95% of the time, they are the invasive white mulberry. Now, there are way more invasive shrubs that are a problem than there are trees. And I'm going to go through a lot of them, and they're more number ones, okay? So you can see, look at all the number ones. Before we only have one, and all the number twos, a ton of number twos. So I'm going to go through these, and hopefully you'll be able to figure out what they are. Took me a while to figure out some of them. Okay. So this was a new one to me. Working in Romans Park, my friend Glenn, the all-knowing tree expert, only because he spent a lot of time trying to figure out, was this invasive or wasn't it, or what was this thing? So you can see they almost look like dogwood leaves, but the fissures on them are deeper. And there's 2 kinds, but both of them have a pointy tip on the ends. I have another slide with that better, but they have glossy leaves and they have very prominent veins, and their berries are black and kind of big. If you scratch some of their bark off, you can see the yellow sapwood and the orange heartwood. So if you're really at a loss trying to figure it out, that's a good way to do it. And the smaller twigs kind of look almost like a cherry with the white bumps. They're not quite lenticels, but they're like that other mulberry. And then when they get older, they get this flaky bark. This is what they look like, their form. They're kind of rounded. So if you see a big rounded shrubbish looking thing, it's only 20 to 25 feet tall. It's about the size of a redbud, So look out for them. But let me go back. At the tip, it's hard to see it, but right here at the very tip, it's like a thorn. That's why I call it buckthorn. So that's how I tell them, because they're pretty hard to tell from some of the other things, but that thorn at the end, it's not really a thorn, it's just a really pointy, growth plate. Huh. Okay. The next one I'm going to talk about is the Japanese barberry, and I'm sure you have all seen this shrub. It's everywhere. It comes in a green, and it also comes in the purple. And unfortunately, it is favorite shelter for the white-footed mouse that carries Lyme disease. In Lyme, Connecticut, there's a ton of these taking over the wild unmanaged areas, and they're trying to rip them all out because they found that in areas where they exist, there's way more Lyme ticks, and they've done studies. The University of Connecticut has done the studies, and they found this. That's pretty close to Lyme, Connecticut. The sort of distinguishing feature, the leaves are kind of very dense on the stalk, and they're pointy thorns on the stalk. So I always know, and they're really hard to prune and hard to take care of because they do have that thorn. They make these little white flowers, which are sort of not very descriptive, you know, they're just kind of there, you don't really see them. And then they turn into berries that the birds eat and spread around. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of different kinds of honeysuckle, and most of them look similar. This one looks a little different. It has tinier leaves, and it's called sweet breath honeysuckle, or Lonicera fragrantissima. Fragrant. It's very fragrant. It smells lemony. I have seen it. I've seen it at Robbins Park. It blooms very early, before the leaves come out. That's how you know. It's and it has white flowers. Or anything we have, any honeysuckle, or we don't really have a native honeysuckle, but these have white flowers and are fragrant. And they have these pink fruits that are sort of double almost. It's like two berries that didn't get separated. And it has this very plated kind of bark that's very thick. And it has a crazy form to it. You can see how it grows. So it's kind of wild. And the leaves are smaller, like I said. Now, this is the one I see the most. This is Amur honeysuckle, and this is the one that's probably the hardest to get out if you're trying to rip it out. It blooms, it leaves out really early, but it blooms later than the other one. And they're blooming right now, and they're fragrant, not extreme fragrance, but they're fragrant, and they have sort of this flaky bark, although I've never seen it that thick. They do grow almost like a tree, and we joke in Robbins Park, there's an area, we call it like the haunted woods in The Wizard of Oz. It's like you're walking through the haunted woods of honeysuckle. So you can tell this one, it has a very characteristic pattern of growth. You can see it's very densely branched, and you can see it has very pointy tips to the leaves. And in the fall, it has those red berries that the birds eat. Now, those berries are high in sugar, but they're not high in fat like our native plants are. So the birds don't get very far on one serving of fruit. This one is Morus honeysuckle, and it's if you want to tell the difference, you can cut it, and the stems are hollow and tan colored on the inside, whereas some of the other ones are solid. When they're saying this native honeysuckle, the only one I think that they're comparing it to is Deer Villa, which is not even a honeysuckle, but it is a native shrub. And it really doesn't look very much like this, but if you wanted to know, you could look at that. It doesn't grow this big either. Now, I always see this characteristic bark, and this is a little easier to get out, and sort of has more surface roots than deep roots. This one's called showy honeysuckle, and it's a hybrid. And you would know it because of the color of the flowers, and it has more rounded leaves than the others. And I'm not really sure when it blooms, but I have not really seen it in Robbins Park or any of the untamed wildernesses in the area. This is Standish honeysuckle, and this has a solid pith to the stem. So if you cut it, it's solid rather than being kind of hollow. And it blooms really early, February to March, and also before the leaves come out. And it has those double berries that look like they don't come apart, and they're more red than the other ones that are sort of light pink, the fragrant ones. I have seen these in cultivated places, but I have not seen them in the wild. I have seen this one, the Tatarica honeysuckle. I've seen the orange fruit, and the root system is shallow, so it's easier to get out, and it blooms in May and has pink flowers. So it's pretty different than most of the rest of them. Now, our friend, Mr. Rockefeller, brought this. He was a landscape architect. He brought this and he planted it everywhere. He thought this was great. It's called jet bead, and I never saw it in cultivation, but I did see it in Robbins Park. And I knew right away because it has very characteristic leaves. They're very, they're very crinkly, right? They look like seersucker. And it has the white flowers, and it's blooming now. And then later it forms these black jet beads. So they, like I said, it was brought here by our pal, Mr. Rockefeller. Now, the honeysuckles were brought here by no, they were brought here by the New York Botanic Garden. So they brought it, they thought it was pretty and smelled good and lots of different kinds. It bloomed at different times, and so that's how we ended up with those. Now, multiflora rose is another story. They bought this, I think the government brought it over as erosion control, or maybe the USDA. Anyhow, it has white flowers. It's just starting to bloom now, and the leaves, when they come out, they're pinkish, and they brought this rosette disease to get rid of it. So it's a virus that infects Chinese roses. And Chinese roses are the roses that come out with the red leaves when they bloom. I mean, when they leaf out. And unfortunately, the pathogen affects a lot of the cultivated roses, like the knockout roses, and you get something like this. But this multiflora rose has these hairy structures where the leaves attach, so you can identify it with that. And then it has the red hips like many other roses, but they're kind of tiny. The hips, they're kind of like berries. And it's very like rangy, and you find it around a lot. I ripped one out when I first moved in. I had one. And another distinguishing feature is that the thorns curve rather than being straight. So you should be able to tell by those characteristics. Japanese spirea. You see this everywhere. They plant it. It grows in the shade. You see it at gas stations. It comes in all different colors, like, you know, yellow leaves, reddish leaves, and it blooms in late summer. And it's reported as invasive in every county except Montgomery County, which, go figure. And it tolerates full shade, but it blooms more in the sun. So unfortunately, I have this in my yard. I thought it was great, grew in the shade. I have nothing else. But I did go to this lady's house where I saw it was everywhere, everywhere. So I make sure I cut every last flower off of it before it goes to seed, and eventually I get around to ripping it out. Then we have the butterfly bush. Everybody knows a butterfly bush, and everybody thinks it's great. And it is great for attracting butterflies, but it is not a host plant for anything. So it has no competition. It grows along. I've seen it growing along the interchange by the turnpike of Fort Washington by 309 there. I mean, how did it get there? I'm sure nobody planted it there. I have a friend who had this in his yard, and he thought it was really nice. He had a couple different ones, and next thing you know, his whole yard is covered with butterfly weed. And he spent hours and hours and hours ripping the stuff out, cutting it down and ripping it out. So the only thing that's been kind of saving us here is that It's not as hardy here as it is in like the Pacific Northwest, where it's warmer over the winter, because we're right at the border of its hardiness zone. So it tends to die back to the ground in the winter, and it's, you know, borderline hardy, but still it is invasive. And there's so many other things you can plant that are, you know, the insects can actually use the leaves for food rather than just the nectar. This is Russian olive. The only place I ever saw this was at the barns, but you can see that it has, now you can't really tell from these pictures, but it's really like silvery. They what do they call it? It's like sparkleberry, you know, like the leaves actually have shiny, sparkly leaves on the back side. And it has thorns. The foliage is really, really shiny. And the berry, and people like to use it because it's a nitrogen fixing plant, but it's not good in the United States. So there's areas where it is just so prolific. It's not as bad here, but it just depends on what your surroundings are. If somebody had this planted in their yard, you might find it everywhere. So the berries are actually speckled. I don't know if you can see it in the picture, but they're speckled like somebody took a very fine paintbrush and put silver spots on it. And the leaves are kind of leathery and elliptical. And the margins, you can see it has some like waviness in the margins. And then it has the fragrant flowers. This is the autumn olive. I'm sorry. It looks very much like the Russian olive, but it's not as pretty. It's not as silvery. Okay, so this is one, the burning bush, and we call it winged euonymus. And they call it winged because it has these little wings along the stems. And the flowers are really small. It's blooming right now. And it has little tiny berries that are almost non-invisible because usually they're under the leaves. And people, there is a native euonymus, but it really looks quite different. And it doesn't have the corky wings on it. And of course, everybody plants this for its red fall color, and it's everywhere. And they say, oh, it's sterile, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you go into some of the unmanaged areas, you will find it, whether it's been planted or not, but it hasn't been planted. It's been planted by birds, let's say. This is one of my nemesises. The privets, I kind of lumped them all together because they're all very similar. They have sort of a branching structure with sort of rounded leaves, and they're shiny, and they come out before any of our native plants do. So you know, a lot of times they stay evergreen in the winter, and they make these berries at the tips, and they have the terminal flowers in the April through June. and then you see the blue fruit. We just kind of go through and cut the berries off just because we can't rip out every shrub, but it spreads by underground rhizomes to make thickets like the elata, the Japanese Angelica tree, and it becomes like one big giant wall of privet, and it's hard to get it out. So it likes kind of wettish areas, which makes it even harder to get out because you can't get a good grip on it in the mud. But if you see it, rip it out. This is a Linden Viburnum. Most viburnums have blue berries, and the Linden Viburnum has more of a sort of a rounder, fatter leaf than most of our natives, and they're sort of wrinkled or crinkly, and they are very tasty for the birds, and they are spread around a lot. So I've seen them in parks in Abington, and they're a big problem. Here's another one, Viburnum plicatum, double file viburnum. And this is very popular. There are sterile cultivars of this that don't make berries, but you know, these are very showy, and people planted them a lot, and now they're spreading around, and they too have the very furrowed leaves and brilliant white flowers. This is Viburnum Sieboldii. It has sort of long oval shaped leaves that are crinkly and shiny. And it too has huge white flowers and lovely red berries, and the birds eat them and spread them everywhere. It's blooming now, and the red fruit is on the plant from August to October, and it turns red in fall. And it grows really fast, and it spreads really fast. And they planted this in Crosswicks because the Audubon Society back in like 1930s didn't know better. And they thought, oh, the birds will love this. It has berries, and now they have thousands of them, and they have to get rid of them. So it's a mess. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to have part 2 later on in the season. I just thought it would be too much to have in one day. So if you have any questions, you can ask them now.
So you can either raise your hand by going into the reactions button and doing the raised hand, and we will unmute you and you can ask your question, or you can put it in the chat box and I will read that off to Cindy. Now, we do have a couple things that were placed in the chat box before during the presentation, so I'm going to read those now. I have a red mulberry in our yard. The berry, ripe and purple, is delicious.
Well, the red mulberry is the native one, so that's not a problem.
Okay, let's see. I always thought the mimosa tree was particular to the Jersey Shore.
Nope. It's everywhere. Everywhere anybody wanted to plant it.
All right, does anybody have any questions? Anybody want to say anything else? We just got a comment, thanks, great talk.
Glad you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot. Sorry, I can't tell you exactly how to get rid of all these. Just keep at it.
All right. Well, I want to thank Cindy and all of you for joining us tonight. Oh, here we go. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Do you do tours of Robbins Park?
We do. And before the COVID, we were going to take you around and show you the invasives. And we actually have bird walks there on Thursday mornings, but not right now. So, but if you're interested, we do work there as volunteers. And you see either Glenn or myself working, then you can ask us and we'll show you whatever you want, whatever we know. If you want to know the natives or you want to know the invasives, we do that.
All right. Well, I'm going to now unmute everybody and everybody can say thank you and good night.
Thank you, Cindy.
You're welcome.
Good to see you again.
You too. I don't know who you are.
Sherry, I was at some of your lectures for the COVID. I'm the PA Master Naturalist.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know who you are.
Okay.
Nice to see you.
All right.
This is Jean Brady. Thanks so much for doing this. It's very interesting. And we've been birding in Robbins Park, so I'm sure we'll see you sometime. So.
Yeah, Jean, you know me, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm in the farm and garden.
Okay.
This is Sandra. I want to thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, Sandra.
So many plants are invasive. They're so pretty.
Yeah, but there's so many pretty native plants. We're working on a habitat garden at Twining Valley, but it's we're not there yet. We'll be starting on that sometime soon.
Will that be like a demo kind of garden or a display garden for natives then? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Sort of, I forget what the word is. Interpretive signs, maybe. We'll see.
Demonstration garden.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
I got a grant from the Hardy Plant Society and I have a design, but right now I'm really busy, so I haven't been over there, but I was working on, collecting volunteers to work, and then the COVID thing hit, and that kind of squelched it.
Right.
But it'll come back, I'm sure. I still have to spend the money by the end of the year somehow, so I will.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Cindy.
Welcome.
That concludes tonight's program.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thanks.